retorica e barocco yes. Ghetto. G. La polemica sul barocco. Anceschi, L. del barocco. Yes. Lu poetiche del barocco letterario in Europa. Yes. De Boccona cant yes. Gusto e genio nel Bartoli. Yes. Montano, R. L'estetica del Rinascimento e del Barocco. Yes. Croci, F. Critica e Trattistica del Barocco. Yes. Croci, B. I Trattisti Italiani del Concertismo e B. Gratian. Yes. Croci, B. Estetica cum scienza dell'espressione e linguistica generale. Yes. Flora, F. Storia della letteratura italiana. Yes. Croci, F. Lu poetiche del barocco in Italia. Calcaterra, F. Il Parnaso in Rivolta. Yes. Il problema del barocco. Marzit, G. L'ingegno e il genio del Seicento. Morpurga Tagliabue, G. Aristotelismo e barocco. Giannacco, C. Il Seicento. Table 3.5. Works on individual Italian 17th-century treatise writers found in 3 reference volumes. Found in the library. Works searched for in the author catalog. Other works by the same author found in the author catalog: Biondolillo, F. Matteo Peregrini e il Sessantismo. Yes. Raimondi, E. Letteratura barocca. Yes. Trattisti e narratori del Seicento. Yes. Studi e problemi di critica testuale. Marocco, C. Un precursor dell'estetica moderna, il card. Sforza Pallavicino. Volpe, L. Lui de Estetiche del Cardinale Sforza Pallavicino. Costanzo, M. Dallo Scaliger al Quadrio. Cope, J. The 1654 edition of Emanuele Tesoro's Il Canonical Aristotelico Pazzi, G. Note perlusive allo style del Canonical Aristotelico Bethel, S. L. Gratian, Tesoro and the Nature of Metaphysical Wit. Mazzio, J. A. Metaphysical Poetry and the Poetics of Correspondence. Menepes Brisca, L. Larguta et Ingegnosa Elocuzione. Vasili, C. Lu Imprise del Tesoro. Yes. L'estetica dell'umanesimo e del Rinascimento. Bianchi, D. Intorno al Canonical Aristotelico Hatzfeld, H. 3 National Deformations of Aristotle, Tesoro, Gratian, Boileau. Found in the library. Works searched for in the author catalog. Other works by the same author found in the author catalog. Yes. L'Italia, la Spagna e la Francia nello sviluppo del barocco letterario. Hock, G. R. Die Welt als Labyrinth. Yes. Hock, G. R. Manierismus in der Literatur. Italian translation. Yes. Schlosser Magnino, J. Die Kunstliteratur. Ulevi, F. Galleria di Scrittori d'Arte. Yes. Il Manierismo del Tasso Mahone, D. Studies in Seicento Art and Theory. Because I am limiting myself to titles referring to Italian treatise writers, I neglect, for example, Panofsky's idea, a concept in art theory, a text that, as I will discover later from other sources, is equally important for the theoretical problem in which I am interested. As we will see, when I consult Franco Croci's essay Le Poetiche del Barocco in Italia in the miscellaneous volume Momenti e Problemi di Storia dell'Estetica. I will discover in that same volume an essay by literary critic Luciano Anceschi on the Poetics of the European Baroque, one that is 3 times as long. Franco Croce did not cite this essay in his chapter on the Baroque, because he was limiting his study to Italian literature. This is an example of how, by discovering a text through a citation, a student can then find other citations in that text, and so on, potentially infinitely. You see that, even starting from a good history of Italian literature, I am making significant progress. I will now glance at the Storia della Letteratura Italiana. Written by the good old Italian literary critic Francesco Flora. He is not an author who lingers on theoretical problems. Instead, he enjoys savoring the wittiness and originality of particular passages. In the texts he analyzes. In fact, his book contains a chapter full of amusing quotes from Tesoro, and many other well-chosen quotes on the metaphoric techniques of 17th-century authors. As for the bibliography, I am not expecting much from a general work that stops at 1940, but it does confirm some of the classical texts I have already cited. The name of Eugenio Dors strikes me. I will have to look for him. On the subject of Tesoro, I find the names of critics C. Trabalza, T. Valori, E. Dervius, and L. Vigliani, and I make a note of them. Now I move on to consult the above-mentioned miscellaneous volume Momenti e Problemi di Storia dell'Estetica. When I find it, I notice that Marzorati is the publisher, so I supplement the index card. Here I find Franco Croce's essay on the Poetics of Italian Baroque literature. It is similar to his Critica e Trattatistica del Barocco that I have already seen, but it was written earlier, so the bibliography is more dated. Yet the approach is more theoretical, and I find the essay very useful. Additionally, the theme is not limited to the treatise writers, as in the previous essay, but deals with literary poetics in general. So, for example, Le Poetiche del Barocco in Italia treats the Italian poet Gabriello Chiabara at some length. And on the subject of Chiabara, the name of literary critic Giovanni Ghetto comes up again. In the Marzorati volume, together with Franco Croce's essay, I find Anceschi's essay Le Poetiche del Barocco Letterario in Europa, an essay that is almost a book in itself. I realize it is quite an important study not only because it philosophically contextualizes the notion of the Baroque and all of its meanings, but also because it explains the dimensions of the question in European culture, including Spain, England, France, and Germany. I again find names that weary on la mentioned in Mario Praz Centrianth. Encyclopedia Treccani. I also find other names, from Bacon to Lilly and Sidney, Gratian, Gongora, Opitz, the theories of wit, agudeza, and ingegno. My thesis may not deal directly with the European Baroque, but these notions must serve as context. In any case, if my bibliography is to be complete, it should reflect the Baroque as a whole. Anceschi's extensivia Seravides referencesto approximately 250 titles. The bibliography at the end is divided into a concise section of general studies and a longer section of more specialized studies arranged by year from 1946 to 1958. The former section highlights the importance of the Ghetto and Helmut Hatzfeld studies, and of the volume Retorica e Barocco, and here I learn that it is edited by Enrico Castelli, whereas Anceschi's essay had already brought my attention to the critical works of Heinrich Wölfflin, Benedetto Croce, and Eugenio Dors. The latter section presents a flood of titles, only a few of which, I wish to make clear, I attempt to locate in the author catalog, because this would have required more time than my allotted limit of 3 afternoons. In any case, I learn of some foreign authors who treated the question from many points of view, and for whom I will nevertheless have to search: Ernst Robert Curtius, René Wellek, Arnold Hauser, and Victor Lucien Tapie. I also find references to the work of Gustave René Hawk and to Eugenio Battisti's Rinascimento e Barocco, a work that deals with the links between the literary metaphor and the poetics of art. I find more references to Morpurgo Tagliabue that confirm his importance to my topic, and I realize that I should also see Galvano della Volpe's work on the Renaissance commentators on Aristotelian Poetics, Poetica del Cinquecento. This realization also convinces me to look at Cesare Vasili's extensive essay in the Marzorati volume that I am still holding, L'Estetica dell'Umanesimo e del Rinascimento, the Aesthetics of Humanism. Renaissance. I have already seen Vasili's name in Franco Croce's bibliography. In the encyclopedia entries on metaphor that I have examined, I have already noticed that the question of metaphor had already arisen in Aristotle's Poetics and Rhetoric. Now I learn from Vasili that during the 16th century there was an entire scene of commentators on Aristotle's Poetics and Rhetoric. I also learn that between these commentators and the Baroque treatise writers there are the theorists of Monismo who discuss the question of ingenuity as it relates to the concept of metaphor. I also notice the recurrence of similar citations and of names like Julius von Schlosser. And before leaving Anseski, I decide to consult his other works on the topic. I record references to De Boccona Cant, Lydia del Barocco, and an article on Gusto e Genio nel Bartoli. However, the Alessandria Library only owns this last article and the book De Boccona Cant. Is my thesis threatening to become too vast? No, I will simply have to narrow my focus and work on a single aspect of my topic, while still consulting many of these books for background information. Athospoin Ticonsul Tracomontano Studi l'Estetica del Rinascimento e del Barocco published in Pensiero della Rinascenza e della Riforma, the 11th volume of the Grande Antologia Filosofica Marzorati. I immediately notice that it is not only a study but also an anthology of texts, many of which are very useful for my work. And I see once again the close relationships between Renaissance scholars of Aristotle's Poetics, the Mannerists, and the Baroque treatise writers. I also find a reference to Traditisti di Arte tra Monismo e Controriforma, a 2-volume anthology published by La Terza. As I page through the catalog to find this title, I discover that the Alessandria Library owns another anthology published by La Terza, Trattati di Poetica e Retorica del Cinquecento. I am not sure if my topic will require first-hand sources, but I note the book just in case. Now I know where to find it. I return to Montano and his bibliography, and here I must do some reconstructive work, because each chapter has its own bibliography. In any case, I recognize many familiar names and, as I read, it dawns on me that I should consult some classic histories of aesthetics, such as the aforementioned Bernard Bozane Case, George Saintsbury's, Marcelino Menendez y Pelayo's, and Catherine Gilbert and Helmut Kunz. I also find the names of the 16th century commentators of Aristotle's Poetics that I've mentioned above. I note these just in case, and I will later learn that Montano anthologized some of them, Della Volpe others, and the La Terza anthology others yet. Montano's bibliography refers me once again to Monismo. Panofsky's idea continues to reappear as a pressing critical reference. And so does Morpurgo Tagliabue's essay Aristotelismo e Barocco. I wonder if I should become more informed on Mannerist treatise writers like Sebastiano Serlio, Lodovico Dolce, Federico Zuccari, Giovanni Paolo Lomazzo, and Giorgio Vasari, but this would lead me to the figurative arts and architecture. Perhaps some classic critical texts like Wolfland's, Panofsky's, Schlosser's, or Battisti's more recent one would suffice. I must also note the importance of non-Italian authors like Sidney, Shakespeare, and Cervantes. Finally, I find in Montano's Bibliography familiar name Essay-Even Gothard fundamental critical studies, Curtius, Schlosser, and Hauser, as well as Italians like Calcaterra, Ghetto, and Seschi, Praz, Ulevi, Marzit, and Raimondi. The circle is tightening. Some names are cited everywhere. To catch my breath, I return to the author catalog and begin to page through it. I find important books in German, most of which are also available in English translation, Panofsky's Idea, Ernst Curtius's famous European literature and the Latin Middle Ages, Schlosser's Die Kunstliteratur. And, while I am looking for Hauser's The Social History of Art, Hauser's Fundamentalvlium Mannerism, The Crisis of the Renaissance and the Origin of Modern Art. Realizing that I must somehow read Aristotle's Rhetoric and Poetics, I look for Aristotle in the author catalog. I am surprised to find 15 antiquarian editions of the Rhetoric published between 1515 and 1837, one with Ermolao Barbaro's commentary, another, Bernardo Segni's translation, another with Averroes and Alessandro Piccolomini's paraphrases, and the Loeb English edition with the parallel Greek text. The Italian edition published by Laterza is absent. As far as the Poetics goes, there are also various editions, including one with Castelvetro Sandro Bortello's 16th century commentaries, the Loeb edition with the parallel Greek text, and Augusto Rostagni's and Monera Valgimigli's two modern Italian translations. This is more than enough. In fact, it is enough for a thesis about Renaissance commentaries on the Poetics. But let us not digress. From various hints in the texts I have consulted, I realize that some observations made by historians Francesco Malizia and Lodovico Antonio Muratori, and by the humanist Girolamo Fracastoro, are also relevant to my thesis. I search for their names in the author catalog, and I learn that the Alessandria Library owns antiquarian editions of these authors. I then find Della Volpi's Poetica del Cinquecento, Sant'Angelo's Il Sessantismo nella Critica, and Zonta's article Rinascimento, Aristotelismo e Barocco. Through the name of Helmuth Hatzfeld, I find a multi-author volume that is interesting in many other respects, La Critica Stylistica e il Barocco, Letterario, Atti, del Secondo Congresso Internazionale di Studi Italiani, that was published in Florence in 1957. I am disappointed to find that the Alessandria Library does not own one of Carmine Giannacco's apparently important works, and also Il Seicento, a volume of the history of literature published by Velarde. The library also does not own Praz's books, Rousset's and Tapier's studies, the oft-quoted volume Retorica e Barocco with Morpurgo Tagliabue's essay, and the works of Eugenio Dors and Menendez y Pelayo. In a nutshell, the Alessandria Library is not the Library of Congress in Washington, nor the Bradens Library in Milan, but all in all I have already secured 35 books, a decent beginning. Nor is this the end of my research. In fact, sometimes a single text can solve a whole series of problems. As I continue checking the author catalog, I decide to take a look at Giovanni Ghetto's La Polemica sul Barocco, in the first volume of the 1956 miscellaneous work Letteratura Italiana. Lou Correnti. I quickly noticed that the study is almost 100 pages long and exceptionally important, because it narrates the entire controversy on Baroque style. I noticed the names of major Italian writers and intellectuals who have been discussing the Baroque from the 17th to the 20th century: Giovanni Vincenzo Gravina, Ludovico Antonio Muratori, Girolamo Tiraboschi, Saverio Bettinelli, Giuseppe Baretti, Vittorio Alfieri, Melchiorre Cesarati, Cesare Cantu, Vincenzo Gioberti, Francesco de Sanctis, Alessandro Manzoni, Giuseppe Mazzini, Giacomo Leopardi, Josue Carducci, up to the 20th century writer Curzio Malaparte and the other authors that I have already noted. And Ghetto quotes long excerpts from many of these authors, which clarifies an issue for me. If I am to write a thesis on the historical controversy on the Baroque, it should be of high scientific originality, it will require many years of work, and its purpose must be precisely to prove that Ghetto's inquiry has been insufficient, or was carried out from a faulty perspective. For a thesis of this kind, I must explore all of these authors. However, works of this kind generally require more experience than that of a hypothetical student in this experiment. If instead I work on the Baroque texts, or the contemporary interpretations of these texts, I will not be expected to complete such an immense project. Now, ghettos. Work provides me with sufficient documentation for the background of my thesis, if not on its specific topic. Extensive works such as ghettos must generate a series of separate index cards. In other words, I will write an index card on Muratori, one on Cesarati, one on Leopardi, and so on. I will record the work in which they express their opinions on the Baroque, and I will copy Ghetto's summary onto each index card, with relevant quotes. If I eventually choose to use this material in my thesis, I must honestly and prudently indicate in a footnote as quoted in Ghetto because I will be using second-hand information. In fact, since we are modeling research done with few means and little time, I will not have time to check the quote against its original source. Therefore, I will not be responsible for the quote's possible imperfections. I will faithfully declare that I took it from another scholar. I will not pretend that I have seen the original information, and I will not have to worry. However, ideally the student would have the means to check each quote with the original text. Having altered my course, the only authors I must not ignore at this point are the Baroque authors on whom I will write my thesis. I must now search for these Baroque authors because, as we have said in section 3.1.2, a thesis must also have primary sources. I cannot write about the treatise writers if I do not read them in their original form. I can trust the critical studies on the mannerist theorists of the figurative arts because they do not constitute the focus of my research, but I cannot ignore a central figure of Baroque poetics such as Tesoro. So let us now turn to the Baroque treatise writers. First of all, there is Ezio Raimondi's anthology Trattatisti e Narratori del Seicento published by Ricciardi that contains 100 pages of Tesoro's Canonical Aristotelico, 60 pages of Peregrini, and 60 of Sforza Pallavicino. If I were writing a 30-page term paper instead of a thesis, this anthology would be more than sufficient. But for my thesis, I also want the entire treatises. Among them I need at least Emanuele Tesoro, Illinois Canonical Aristotelico, Matteo Peregrini, Del Acutaz, and I Fonti dell'Ingegno Redatti a Arte, Cardinal Sforza Pallavicino, Del Beni and Trattato dello Stile e del Dialogo. I begin to search for these in the special collections section of the author catalog, and I find two editions of the Canonical, one from 1670 and the other from 1685. It is a real pity that the first 1654 edition is absent, all the more since I learned that content has been added to the various editions. I do find two 19th century editions of Sforza Pallavicino's complete works, but I do not find Peregrini. Incidentally, in some of the critical texts I previously consulted, I found scattered traces of Agostino Mascardi's 1636 Treatise de l'arte historica, a work that makes many observations on the art of writing but is not included in these texts among the items of Baroque treatise writing. Here in Alessandria there are 5 editions, 3 from the 17th and 2 from the 19th century. Should I write a thesis on Mascardi? If I think about it, this is not such a strange question. If a student cannot travel far from his home, he must work with the material that is locally available. Once, a philosophy professor told me that he had written a book on a specific German philosopher only because his institute had acquired the entire new edition of the philosopher's complete works. Otherwise, he would have studied a different author. Certainly not a passionate scholarly endeavor, but it happens. Now, let us rest on our oars. What have I done here in Alessandria? I put together a critical bibliography that, to be conservative, includes at least 300 titles, if I record all the references I found. In the end, in Alessandria I found more than 30 of these 300 titles, in addition to original texts of at least 2 of the authors I could study, Tesoro and Sforza Pallavicino. This is not bad for a small city. But is it enough for my thesis? Let us answer this question candidly. If I were to write a thesis in 3 months and rely mostly on indirect sources, these 30 titles would be enough. The books I have not found are probably quoted in those I have found, so if I assembled my survey effectively, I could build a solid argument. The trouble would be the bibliography. If I include only the texts that I actually read in their original form, my advisor could accuse me of neglecting a fundamental text. And what if I cheat? We have already seen how this process is both unethical and imprudent. I do know one thing for certain: for the first 3 months I can easily work locally, between sessions in the library and at home with books that I've borrowed. I must remember that reference books and very old books do not circulate, nor do volumes of periodicals. But I can borrow most other kinds of books. In the following months, I could travel to the city of my university for some intensive sessions, and I could easily work locally from September to December. Also, in Alessandria, I could find editions of all the texts by Tesoro and Sforza Pallavicino. Better still, I should ask myself if it would not be better to gamble everything on only one of these 2 authors, by working directly with the original text and using the bibliographical material I found for background information. Afterward, I will have to determine what other books I need, and travel to Turin or Genoa to find them. With a little luck, I will eventually find everything I need. And thanks to the fact that I've chosen an Italian topic, I have avoided the need to travel, say, to Paris or Oxford. Nevertheless, these are difficult decisions to make. Once I have created the bibliography, it would be wise to return to the advisor and show him what I have. He will be able to suggest appropriate solutions to help me narrow the scope, and tell me which books are absolutely necessary. If I am unable to find some of these in Alessandria, I can ask the librarian if the Alessandria Library can borrow them from other libraries. I can also travel to the university library, where I might identify a series of books and articles. I would lack the time to read them, but, for the articles, the Alessandria Library could write the university library and request photocopies. An important article of 20 pages would cost me a couple of dollars plus shipping costs. In theory, I could make a different decision. In Alessandria, I have some pre-1900 editions of 2 major Baroque treatise authors, and a sufficient number of critical texts. These are enough to understand these 2 authors, if not to say something new on a historiographical or philological level. Let us suppose that I explore no more than 4 or 5 books tracing contemporary theories of metaphor. For these, I would suggest Jacobson's Preliminaries to Speech Analysis, the Leech Group Muessa General Rhetoric, and Albert Henry's Metonymy et Metaphor. Here, I have the elements to trace a structuralist history of the metaphor. And they are all books available on the market. They cost about $11 altogether, and they have been translated into Italian. At this point, I could even compare the modern theories of metaphor with the Baroque theories. For a work of this kind, I might possibly use Aristotle's texts, Tesoro, 30 or so studies on Tesoro, and the 3 contemporary reference texts to put together an intelligent thesis, with peaks of originality and accurate references to the Baroque, but no claim to philological discoveries. And all this without leaving Alessandria, except to find in Turin or Genoa no more than 2 or 3 fundamental books that were missing in Alessandria. But these are all hypotheses. I could become so fascinated with my research that I choose to dedicate not 1 but 3 years to the study of the Baroque, or I could take out a loan or look for a grant to study at a more relaxed pace. Do not expect this book to tell you what to put in your thesis, or what to do with your life. What I set out to demonstrate with this experiment is that a student can arrive at a small library with little knowledge on a topic and, after 3 afternoons, can acquire sufficiently clear and complete ideas. In other words, it is no excuse to say, I live in a small city, I do not have the books, I do not know where to start, and nobody is helping me. Naturally, the student must choose topics that lend themselves to this game. For example, a thesis on Kripke and Hintikau's logic of possible worlds may not have been a wise choice for our hypothetical student. In fact, I did some research on this topic in Alessandria, and it cost me little time. A first look for logic in the subject catalog revealed that the library has at least 15 notable books on formal logic, including works by Tarski, Lukasiewicz, Quine, some Handbooks and Semestidis Federicasari, Wittgenstein, Strawson, etc. But predictably, it has nothing on the most recent theories of modal logic, material that is found mostly in specialized journals and is even absent from some university libraries. However, on purpose I chose a topic that nobody would have taken on during their final year without some kind of previous knowledge, or without already owning some fundamental books on the topic. I'm not saying that such a topic is only for students who have the resources to purchase books and for frequent travel to larger libraries. I know a student who was not rich, but who wrote a thesis on a similar topic by staying in a religious hostel and purchasing very few books. Admittedly, despite his small sacrifices, his family supported him and he was able to devote himself full-time to this project because he didn't have to work. There is no thesis that is intrinsically for rich students, because even the student who chooses the variations of beach fashion in Acapulco over a 5-year period can always search for a foundation willing to sponsor such a research project. This said, a student should obviously avoid certain topics if he is in a particularly challenging situation. For this reason, I am trying to demonstrate here how to cook a meal with meat and potatoes, if not with gourmet ingredients. 3.2.5 Must you read books? If so, what should you read first? The examples in this chapter suggest that writing a thesis involves putting together a great number of books. But does a student always write a thesis on books and with books? We have already seen that there are experimental theses that document research in the field, perhaps conducted while observing mice in a maze for many months. Now, I do not feel confident giving precise suggestions on this type of research. Here the method depends on the discipline, and people who embark on this kind of research already live in the laboratory. They work with and learn from other researchers, and they probably do not need this book. However, as I have already said, even in this kind of thesis it is necessary to contextualize the experiment with a discussion of previous scientific literature, and so even here the student must deal with books. The same would be true of a thesis in sociology that required the candidate to spend a long period of time in a real social environment. This student will need books, if nothing else, to understand how others have already carried out similar research projects. There are even thesis projects that require the student to page through newspapers or parliamentary acts, but even these require background literature. And finally, there are the theses that discuss only books, and in general these are in the subjects of literature, philosophy, the history of science, canon law, and formal logic. In Italian universities, these are the majority, especially for degrees in the humanities. Consider that an American student who studies cultural anthropology has the Native Americans right around the corner, or finds money to do research in the Congo, while the Italian student usually resigns himself to writing a thesis on Franz Boas's thought. Naturally, more and more students are writing ethnographic theses that involve researching Italian society, but even in these cases the library work is relevant, if only to search previous folklore collections. Let us say that, for reasons that by now should be easy to understand, this book addresses the vast majority of theses written on books, and using only books. Here we should reiterate that a thesis on books usually employs two kinds, the books it talks about, and the books that help it talk. In other words, the texts that are the object of the study are the primary sources, and the critical literature on those texts constitutes the secondary sources. Regarding our experiment in Alessandria, the original texts of the Baroque treatise writers are the primary sources, and all those who wrote about the Baroque treatise writers are secondary sources. The following question therefore arises: should a student deal immediately with the primary sources, or first cover the critical literature? The question may be meaningless for two reasons, because the decision depends on the situation of the student, who may already know his author well and decide to study him in depth, or may be approaching for the first time a very difficult and perhaps seemingly unintelligible author. This is a vicious circle, because the primary source can be incomprehensible without the preliminary critical literature, but it is difficult to evaluate the critical literature without knowing the primary source. However, the question is reasonable when posed by a disoriented student, perhaps our hypothetical student who is dealing with the Baroque treatise writers for the first time. He might ask us whether he should begin immediately reading Tesoro, or should first cut his teeth on Ghetto, and Sasky, Raimondi, and other critics. It seems to me the most sensible answer is this: approach 2 or 3 of the most general critical texts immediately, just to get an idea of the background against which your author moves. Then approach the original author directly, and always try to understand exactly what he says. Afterward, explore the rest of the critical literature. Finally, return to examine the author in the light of the newly acquired ideas. But this advice is quite abstract. In reality, students tend to follow the rhythm of their desire, and often there is nothing wrong with consuming texts in a disorderly way. The student can meander, alternating his objectives, provided that a thick web of personal notes, possibly in the form of index cards, keeps track of these adventurous wanderings. Naturally, the approach depends on the researcher's psychological structure. There are monochronic people and polychronic people. The monochronic succeed only if they work on one endeavor at a time. They cannot read while listening to music. They cannot interrupt a novel to begin another without losing the thread. At their worst, they are unable to have a conversation while they shave or put on their makeup. The polychronic are the exact opposite. They succeed only if they cultivate many interests simultaneously. If they dedicate themselves to only one venture, they fall prey to boredom. The monochronic are more methodical but often have little imagination. The polychronic seem more creative, but they are often messy and fickle. In the end, if you explore the biographies of great thinkers and writers, you will find that there were both polychronic and monochronic among them. For the work plan and the index. Cards. 4.1. The table of contents as a working hypothesis. After you have conducted your bibliographical research, one of the first things you can do to begin writing your thesis is to compose the title, the introduction, and the table of contents, that is, exactly all those things that most authors do at the end. This advice seems paradoxical. Why start from the end? For one thing, consider that the table of contents usually appears at the beginning of a work, so that the reader can immediately get an idea of what he will find as he reads. Similarly, if you begin writing your thesis by composing the table of contents, it may provide a clearer idea of what you must write. It can function as a working hypothesis, and it can be useful to immediately define the limits of your thesis. You may object to this idea, realizing that as you proceed in the work, you will be forced to repeatedly revise this hypothetical table of contents or perhaps retee it altogether. This is certainly true, but you will restructure it more effectively if you have a starting point from which to work. Imagine that you have a week to take a 600-mile car trip. Even if you are on vacation, you will not leave your house and indiscriminately begin driving in a random direction. You will make a rough plan. You may decide to take the Milan-Naples highway, with slight detours through Florence, Siena, Arezzo, possibly a longer stop in Rome, and also a visit to Monte Cassino. If you realize along the way that Siena takes you longer than anticipated, or that it is also worth visiting San Gimignano, you may decide to eliminate Monte Cassino. Once you arrive in Arezzo, you may have the sudden, irrational, last-minute idea to turn east and visit Urbino, Perugia, Assisi, and Gubbio. This means that, for substantial reasons, you may change your itinerary in the middle of the voyage. But you will modify that itinerary, and not no itinerary. So it happens with your thesis. Make yourself a provisional table of contents and it will function as your work plan. Better still if this table of contents is a summary, in which you attempt a short description of every chapter. By proceeding in this way, you will first clarify for yourself what you want to do. Secondly, you will be able to propose an intelligible project to your advisor. Thirdly, you will test the clarity of your ideas. There are projects that seem quite clear as long as they remain in the author's mind, but when he begins to write, everything slips through his fingers. He may have a clear vision of the starting and ending points, but then he may realize that he has no idea of how to get from one to the other, or of what will occupy the space between. A thesis is like a chess game that requires a player to plan in advance all the moves he will make to checkmate his opponent. To be more precise, your work plan should include the title, the table of contents, and the introduction. Composing a good title is already a project. I am not talking about the title on the first page of the document that you will deliver to the registrar's office many months from now, one that will invariably be so generic as to allow for infinite variations. I am talking of the secret title of your thesis, the one that then usually appears as the subtitle. A thesis may have as its public title Radio Commentary and the Attempted Murder of Palmiro Togliatti, but its subtitle will be Radio Commentator's Use of Gino Bartali's Tour de France Victory to Distract the Public from the Attempted Murder of Palmiro Togliatti. This is to say that after you have focused on a theme, you must decide to treat only one specific point within that theme. The formulation of this point constitutes a sort of question: has there in fact been a deliberate political use of a sport celebrity's victory to distract the public from the attempted murder of the Italian Communist Party leader Palmiro Togliatti? And can a content analysis of the radio news commentary reveal such an effort? In this way, the secret title becomes an essential part of the work plan. After you have formulated this question, you must subdivide your topic into logical sections that will correspond to chapters in the table of contents. For example, 1. Critical literature on the topic. 2. The event. 3. The radio news. 4. Quantitative analysis of the news and its programming schedule. 5. Content analysis of the news. 6. Conclusions. Or you can plan a development of this sort. 1. The event, synthesis of the various sources of information. 2. Radio news commentary on the attempted murder before Bartali's victory. 3. Radio news commentary on the attempted murder over the 3 days following Bartali's victory. 4. Quantitative comparison between the two sets of news. 5. Comparative content analysis of the two sets of news. 6. Sociopolitical evaluation. Ideally, the table of contents should be more detailed than this example, as we have already said. If you wish, you can write it on a large sheet of paper with the titles in pencil, canceling them and substituting others as you proceed, so that you can track the phases of the reorganization. Another method to compose the hypothetical table of contents is the tree structure. This method allows you to add various branches. Whatever method you use, a hypothetical table of contents should contain the following: 1. The state of the issue. 2. The previous research. 3. Your hypothesis. 4. Your supporting data. 5. Your analysis of the data. 6. The demonstration of your hypothesis. 7. Conclusions and suggestions for further research. The third phase of the work plan is to draft the introduction. The draft should consist of an analytical commentary related to the table of contents. With this work, we propose to demonstrate this thesis. The previous research has left many questions unanswered, and the data gathered is still insufficient. In the first chapter, we will attempt to establish this point. In the second chapter, we will tackle this other point. In conclusion, we will attempt to demonstrate A, B, and C. We have set these specific limits for the work. Within these limits, we will use the following method. And so on. The function of this fictitious introduction is to allow you to give your ideas a primary direction that will not change unless you consciously restructured the table of contents. This way, you will control your detours and your impulses. This introduction is also useful for telling your advisor what you want to do. But it is even more useful for determining whether your ideas are organized. Imagine an Italian student who graduates from high school, where he presumably learned to write because he was assigned an immense quantity of essays. Then he spends 4, 5, or 6 years at the university, where he is generally not required to write. When the time comes to write his thesis, he finds himself completely out of practice. Writing his thesis will be a great shock, and it is a bad idea to postpone the writing process until the last minute. Since the student would ideally begin writing as soon as possible, it would be prudent for him to start by writing his own work plan. Be careful, because until you are able to write a table of contents and an introduction, you cannot be sure that what you write in your thesis ifio canatriteeth introduction, it means that you do not yet have clear ideas on how to begin. If you do in fact have clear ideas on how to begin, it is because you at least suspect where you will arrive. And it is precisely on the basis of this suspicion that you must write your introduction, as if it were a review of the already completed work. Also, do not be afraid to go too far with your introduction, as there will always be time to step back. At this point, it should be clear that you will continuously rewrite the introduction and the table of contents as you proceed in your work. This is the way it is done. The final table of contents and introduction will be different from these first drafts. This is normal. If this were not the case, it would mean that all of your research did not inspire a single new idea. Even if you are determined enough to follow your precise plan from beginning to end, you will have missed the point of writing a thesis if you do not revise as you progress with your work. What will distinguish the first from the final draft of your introduction? The fact that in the latter you will promise much less than you did in the former, and you will be much more cautious. The goal of the final introduction will be to help the reader penetrate the thesis. Ideally, in the final introduction you will avoid promising something that your thesis does not provide. The goal of a good final introduction is to so satisfy and enlighten the reader that he does not need to read any further. This is a paradox, but often a good introduction in a published book provides a reviewer with the right ideas and prompts him to speak about the book as the author wished. But what if the advisor read the thesis and noticed that you announced in the introduction results that you did not realize? This is why the introduction must be cautious, and it must promise only what the thesis will then deliver. The introduction also establishes the center and periphery of your thesis, a distinction that is very important, and not only for methodological reasons. Your committee will expect you to be significantly more comprehensive on what you have defined as the center than on what you have defined as the periphery. If, in a thesis on the partisan war in Monferrato, you establish that the center is the movements of the Badogliane formations, the committee will forgive a few inaccuracies or approximations with regard to the Garibaldine brigades, but will require complete information on the Franchi and Maori formations. To determine the center of your thesis, you must make some decisions regarding the material that is available to you. You can do this during the bibliographical research process described in Chapter 3, before you compose your work plan in the manner described at the beginning of this chapter. By what logic should we construct our hypothetical table of contents? The choice depends on the type of thesis. In a historical thesis, you could have a chronological plan, or a cause and effect plan. You could also choose a spatial plan, or a comparative contrastive plan. In an experimental thesis, you could have an inductive plan in which you would move from particular evidence to the proposal of a theory. A logical mathematical thesis might require a deductive plan, beginning with the theory's proposal and moving on to its possible applications to concrete examples. I would argue that the critical literature on your topic can offer you good examples of work plans, provided you use it critically, that is, by comparing the various approaches to find the example that best corresponds to the needs of your research question. Bibliography contends already establishes the logical subdivision of thesis into chapters, sections, and subsections. On the modalities of this subdivision, see section 6.4. Here too, a good binary subdivision allows you to make additions without significantly altering the original order. For example, 1 central question 1.1 subquestions. 1.1.1 principal subquestion 1.1.2 secondary subquestion. 1.2 development of the central question 1.2.1 first ramification 1.2.2 second ramification. You can also represent this structure as a tree diagram with lines that indicate successive ramifications, and that you may introduce without disturbing the work's general organization. Table 4.1. Once you have arranged the table of contents, you must make sure to always correlate its various points to your index cards and any other documentation you are using. These correlations must be clear from the beginning and clearly displayed through abbreviations and/or colors so that they can help you organize your cross-references. You have already seen examples of cross-references in this book. Often the author speaks of something that has already been treated in a previous chapter, and he refers, in parentheses, to the number of the chapter, section, or subsection. These cross-references avoid unnecessary repetition and also demonstrate the cohesion of the work as a whole. A cross-reference can signify that the same concept is valid from two different points of view, that the same example demonstrates two different arguments, that what has been said in a general sense is also applicable to a specific point in the same study, and so on. A well-organized thesis should abound in cross-references. If there are none, it means that every chapter proceeds on its own, as if everything that has been said in the previous chapters no longer matters. There are undoubtedly thesis types that can work this way, but cross-references should become necessary at least in their conclusions. A well-written hypothetical table of contents is the numerical grid that allows you to create cross-references, instead of needlessly shuffling through papers and notes to locate a specific topic. This is how I have written the very book you are reading. So as to mirror the logical structure of the thesis, the table of contents must be articulated in chapters, sections, and subsections. To avoid long explanations, I suggest that you take a look at this book's table of contents. This book is rich in sections and subsections, and sometimes even more minute subdivisions not included in the table of contents. The example below illustrates how a table of contents should mirror the logical structure of the thesis. If a section 1.2.1 develops as a corollary to 1.2, this must be graphically represented in the table of contents. Table of contents. 1. The subdivision of the text 1.1. The chapters 1.1.1 spacing 1.1.2 indentation 1.2. The sections 1.2.1 different kinds of titles. 1.2.2 possible subdivision in subsections 2. The final draft. 2.1 typing agency or typing on your own. 2.2 The cost of a typewriter. 3. The bookbinding. This example also illustrates that the different chapters need not necessarily adhere to the same pattern of subdivision. The nature of the argument may require that one chapter be divided into many subsections, while another can proceed swiftly and continuously under a general title. A thesis may not require many divisions. Also, subdivisions that are too minute may interrupt the continuity of the argument. But keep in mind that a detailed subdivision helps to control the subject and allows readers to follow your argument. For example, if I see that an observation appears under subsection 1.2.2, I know immediately that it is something that refers to section 2 of chapter 1, and that it has the same importance as the observation under subsection 1.2.1. One last observation: only after you have composed a solid table of contents may you allow yourself to begin writing other parts of your thesis, and at this point you are not required to start with the first chapter. In fact, usually a student begins to draft the part of his thesis about which he feels most confident, and for which he has gathered the best documentation. But he can do this only if, in the background, there is the table of contents providing a working hypothesis. 4.2. Index cards and notes. 4.2.1 Various types of index cards and their purpose. Begin to read the material as your bibliography grows. It is unrealistic to think Thaudio will compile a complete bibliography before you actually begin to read. In practice, after putting together a preliminary list of titles, you can immerse yourself in these. Sometimes, before a student even starts a bibliography, he begins by reading a single book, and from its citations he begins to compile a bibliography. In any case, as you read books and articles, the references thicken, and the bibliography file that we have described in Chapter 3 grows bigger. Ideally, when you begin writing your thesis, you would have all the necessary books at home, both new and antique. But this ideal condition is very rare, even for a professional scholar. In any case, let us imagine that you have been able to locate and purchase all the books that you need. In principle, the only index cards you will need at this point are the bibliographical cards I have described in section 3.2.2. You will prepare your work plan with your chapters and sections numbered progressively, and as you read the books you will underline them, and you will write in the margins the abbreviations of your table of contents various chapters. Similarly, you will place a book's abbreviation and the page number near the chapters in your table of contents, so that you will know where to look for an idea or quote when the time comes for writing. Let us look at a specific example. Suppose you write a thesis on the concept of possible worlds in American science fiction, and that subsection 4.5.6 of your plan is the time warp as a gateway to possible worlds. As you read Chapter 21, page 132 of Robert Sheckley's Mind Swap, you will learn that Marvin's Uncle Max stumbled into a time warp while playing golf at the Fairhaven Country Club in Stanhope, and found himself transferred to the planet Celsus V. You will write the following in the margin. T. Time warp. This note refers to a specific subsection of your thesis. Similarly, you will write the following in subsection 4.5.6 of your work plan. Cf. Sheckley, Mind Swap, 132. In this area, you will already have noted references to Frederick Brown's What Mad Universe and Robert A. Heinlein's The Door into Summer. However, this process makes a few assumptions: that you have the book at home, that you own it and therefore can underline it, and that you have already formulated the work plan in its final form. Suppose you do not have the book, because it is rare and the only copy you can find is in the library, or you have it in your possession, but you have borrowed it and cannot underline it, or that you own it, but it might happen to be an incunabulum of inestimable value, or that, as we have already said, you must continually restructure the work plan as you go. Here you will run into difficulties. This last situation is the most common. As you proceed, the plan grows and changes, and you cannot continuously revise the notes you have written in the margins of your books. Therefore, these notes should be generic, for example, possible worlds. But how can you compensate for the imprecision of such a note? By creating idea index cards and keeping them in an idea file. You can use a series of index cards with titles such as parallelisms between possible worlds, inconsistencies, structure variations, time warps, etc. For example, the time warps card will contain a precise reference to the pages in which Sheckley discusses this concept. Afterward, you can place all the references to time warps at the designated point of your final work plan, yet you can also move the index card, merge it with the others, and place it before or after another card in the file. Similarly, you might find it useful to create thematic index cards and the appropriate file, ideal for a thesis on the history of ideas. If your work on possible worlds in American science fiction explores the various ways in which different authors confronted various logical cosmological problems, this type of file will be ideal. But let us suppose that you have decided to organize your thesis differently, with an introductory chapter that frames the theme, and then a chapter for each of the principal authors. Or even a series of chapters each dedicated to an exemplary novel. In this case, you need an author file. The author index card Sheckley will contain the references needed to find the passages in which he writes about possible worlds. And you may also choose to divide this file into sections on time warps, parallelisms, inconsistencies, etc. Let us suppose instead that your thesis addresses the question in a much more theoretical way, using science fiction as a reference point but in fact discussing the logic of possible worlds. The science fiction references will be less systematic and will instead serve as a source of entertaining quotes. In this case, you will need a quote file, where you will record on the time warps index card a particularly apt phrase from Sheckley, and on the parallelisms index card, you will record Brown's description of two perfectly identical universes where the only variation is the lacing pattern of the protagonist's shoelaces. And so on. But what if Sheckley's book is not currently available, but you remember reading it at a friend's house in another city, long before you envisioned a thesis that included themes of time warps and parallelism? In this case, you fortunately prepared a readings index card on MindSwap at your friend's house, including its bibliographical information, a general summary, a series of evaluations addressing its importance, and a series of quotes that at the time seemed particularly apt. See sections 3.2.2 and 4.2.3 for more information on the readings file. So depending on the context, we can create index cards of various types: connection index cards that link ideas and sections of the work plan, question index cards dealing with how to confront a particular problem, recommendation index cards that note ideas provided by others, suggestions for further developments, etc. Each type of index card should have a different color, and should include in the top right corner abbreviations that cross-reference one series of cards to another, and to the general plan. The result is something majestic. But must you really write all these index cards? Of course not. You can have a simple readings file instead, and collect all your other ideas in notebooks. You can limit yourself to the quote file because your thesis starts from a very precise plan, has little critical literature to examine, and simply requires you to collect abundant textual material. As you can see, the nature of the thesis suggests the nature of the index cards. My only suggestion is that a given file be complete and unified. For example, suppose that you have books by Smith, Rossi, Braun, and de Gomera at home, while in the library you have read books by DuPont, Lupescu, and Nagasaki. If you file only these three, and rely on memory for the other four, how will you proceed when the time comes to begin writing? Will you work half with books and half with index cards? And if you have to restructure your work plan, what materials will you need? Books, index cards, notebooks, or notes? Rather, it will be useful to file cards on DuPont, Lupescu, and Nagasaki in full and with an abundance of quotes, but also to create more succinct index cards for Smith, Rossi, Braun, and de Gomera, perhaps by documenting the page numbers of relevant quotes, instead of copying them in their entirety. At the very least, always work on homogeneous material that is easy to move and handle. This way, you will know at a glance what you have read and what remains to be read. With that said, in some cases it is convenient and useful to put everything on index cards. Imagine a literary thesis in which you must find and comment on many significant quotes on the same topic, but originating from many different authors. Suppose your topic is the concept of life as art in Romantic and Decadent writers. In Table 4.2 you will find examples of 4 index cards that gather useful quotes on this topic. As you can see, each index card bears in the top left corner the abbreviation QD to distinguish it from other types of index cards, and then includes the theme Life is Art. Why do I specify the theme even though I already know what it is? Because the thesis could develop so that Life is Art becomes only a part of the work, because this file could also serve me after the thesis and end up merged with a quote file on other themes. Because I could find these cards 20 years later and ask myself what the devil they refer to. In addition to these two headings, I have noted the quote's author. In this case, the last name suffices because you are supposed to already have biographical index cards on these authors, or have written about them at the beginning of your thesis. Finally, the body of the index card bears the quote, however short or long it may be. Table 4.2 Quote Index Cards. Let us look at the index card for Whistler. There is a quote in Italian followed by a question mark. This means that I found the sentence quoted in another author's book, but I am not sure where it comes from, whether it is correct, or whether the original is in English. After I started this card, I happened to find the original text, and I recorded it along with the appropriate references. I can now use this index card for a correct citation. Let us turn to the card for Villiers de l'Isle Adam. I have written the quote from the English translation of the French original. I know what book it comes from, but the information is incomplete. This is a good example of an index card that I must complete. Similarly incomplete is the card for Gautier. Wilde's index card is complete, however, with the original quote in English. Now, I could have found Wilde's original quote in a copy of the book that I have at home, but shame on me if I neglected writing the index card, because I will forget about it by the time I am finishing my thesis. Shame on me also if I simply wrote on the index card see page 34 without copying the quote, because when the time comes to write my thesis, I will need all of the texts at hand in order to copy the exact quotations. Therefore, although writing index cards takes some time, it will save you much more in the end. Table 4.3 Connection Index Card. Table 4.3 shows an example of a connection index card for the thesis on metaphor in 17th century treatise writers that we discussed in section 3.2.4. Here I used the abbreviation CON to designate the type of card, and I wrote a topic that I will research in depth, the passage from the tactile to the visual. I do not yet know if this topic will become a chapter, a small section, a simple footnote, or even the central topic of the thesis. I annotated some ideas that came to me from reading a certain author, and indicated the books to consult and the ideas to develop. As I page through my index cards once the first draft of my thesis is completed, I will see whether I have neglected an idea that was important, and I will need to make some decisions, revise the thesis to make this idea fit, decide that it was not worth developing, insert a footnote to show that I had the idea in mind, but did not deem its development appropriate for that specific topic. Once I have completed the thesis, I could also decide to dedicate my future research precisely to that idea. Remember that an index card file is an investment that you make during your thesis, but if you intend to keep studying, it will pay off years, and sometimes decades, later. I will not elaborate further on the various types of index cards. Let us limit ourselves to discussing how to organize the primary sources, along with the readings index cards of the secondary sources. For point 2.2 Organizing the primary sources. Readings index cards are useful for organizing critical literature. I would not use index cards, or at least not the same kind of index cards, to organize primary sources. In other words, if you compose a thesis on Joyce, you will naturally write index cards for all the books and articles on Joyce that you are able to find, but it would be strange to create index cards for Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake. The same would apply if you wrote a thesis on articles of the Italian Civil Code, or a thesis in the history of mathematics on Felix Klein's Erlangen program. Ideally, you will always have the primary sources at hand. This is not difficult, as long as you are dealing with books by a classic author available in many good critical editions, or those by a contemporary author that are readily available on the market. In any case, the primary sources are an indispensable investment. You can underline a book or a series of books that you own, even in various colors. Let us talk briefly about underlining. Underlining personalizes the book. The marks become traces of your interest. They allow you to return to the book even after a long period and find at a glance what originally interested you. But you must underline sensibly. Some people underline everything, which is equivalent to not underlining at all. On the other hand, it is possible that on the same page there is information that interests you on different levels. In that case, it is essential to differentiate the underlining. Use colors. Use markers with a fine point. Assign a color to each topic and use the same colors on the work plan and the various index cards. This will be useful when you are drafting your work because you will know right away that red refers to passages important for the first chapter and green to those important for the second chapter. Associate an abbreviation with each color. For example, going back to our topic of possible worlds in science fiction, use the abbreviation TW to signal everything pertinent to time warps, or I to mark inconsistencies between possible worlds. If your thesis concerns multiple authors, assign an abbreviation to each of them. Use abbreviations to emphasize the relevance of information. A bracket with the annotation IMP can signify a very important passage, and you will not need to underline each individual line. QD will indicate not only that the passage is important, but that you also want to quote it in its entirety. QDTW will indicate that the passage is an ideal quote to illustrate the question of time warps. Use abbreviations to designate the passages you must reread. Some passages may seem obscure to you when you first read them. You can mark the top margins of these pages with a big R, so that you know you must review them as you go deeper into the subject, and after other readings have clarified these ideas for you. When should you not underline? When the book is not yours, obviously, or if it is a rare edition of great commercial value that you cannot modify without devaluing. In these cases, photocopy the important pages and underline those. Or get a small notebook where you can copy the salient passages, with your comments interspersed. Or develop a special file for the primary sources, although this would require a huge effort, because you would have to practically catalog the texts page by page. However, this can work if your thesis is on Alain Fournier's Le Grand Moulins, a very short little book. But what if it is on Hegel's The Science of Logic? And what if, returning to our experiment in Alessandria's library, you must catalog the 17th century edition of Tesoro's Canonical Aristotelico? You will have to resort to photocopies and the aforementioned notebook, annotated throughout with colors and abbreviations. Supplement the underlining with adhesive page markers. Copy the abbreviations and colors on the portion of the marker that sticks out from the pages. Beware the alibio-photocopies. Photocopies are indispensable instruments. They allow you to keep with you a text you have already read in the library, and to take home a text you have not read yet. But a set of photocopies can become an alibi. A student makes hundreds of pages of photocopies and takes them home, and the manual labor he exercises in doing so gives him the impression that he possesses the work. Owning the photocopies exempts the student from actually reading them. This sort of vertigo of accumulation and neo-capitalism of information happens to many. Defend yourself from this trap. As soon as you have the photocopy, read it and annotate it immediately. If you are not in a great hurry, do not photocopy something new before you own the previous set of photocopies. There are many things that I do not know because I photocopied a text and then relaxed as if I had read it. If the book is yours and it does not have antiquarian value, do not hesitate to annotate it. Do not trust those who say that you must respect books. You respect books by using them, not leaving them alone. Even if the book is unmarked, you won't make much. money reselling it to a bookseller, so you may as well leave traces of your ownership. 4.2.3 The importance of readings index cards. Among all the types of index cards we have discussed, the most common and the most indispensable are the readings index cards. These are where you precisely annotate all the references contained in a book or article, transcribe key quotes, record your evaluation, and append other observations. In short, the readings index card perfects the bibliographical index card described in Section 3. 2.2 The latter contains only the information useful for tracking down the book, while the former contains all the information on a book or article and therefore must be much larger. You can use standard formats or make your own cards, but in general they should correspond to half a letter size sheet. They should be made of cardboard, so that you can easily page through them in the index card box, or gather them into a pack bound with a rubber band. They should be made of a material appropriate for both a ballpoint and a fountain pen, so that they do not absorb or diffuse the ink, but instead allow the pen to run smoothly. Their structure should be more or less that of the model index cards proposed in tables 4.4 through 4.11. Nothing prohibits you from filling up many index cards, and this might actually be a good idea for important books. The cards should be numbered consecutively, and the front of each card should bear abbreviated information about the book or article in question. There are many ways to catalog the book on your readings index card. Your method also depends on your memory, as there are people who have poor memories and need to write everything, and others who only require a quick note. Let us say that the following is the standard method. 1. Record precise bibliographical information that is, if possible, more complete than that you have recorded on the bibliographical index card. The latter helped you locate the book, while the readings index card will help you talk about the book and cite it properly in the final bibliography. You should have the book in your hands when you write the readings index card, so that you can obtain all the available information, such as the edition, the publisher's information, etc. 2. Record the author's information, if he is not a well-known authority. 3. Write a short summary of the book or article. 4. Transcribe the full text of passages you wish to quote. Use quotation marks and note precisely the page number or numbers. You may also want to record extra quotes to provide context when you are writing. Be sure not to confuse a quote with a paraphrase. 5. Record your personal comments throughout your summary. To avoid mistaking them for the author's own thoughts, write your comments inside square brackets and in color. 6. Mark the card with the appropriate abbreviation or color so that it clearly corresponds to the correct section of your work. If your card refers to multiple sections, write multiple abbreviations. If it refers to the thesis as a whole, designate this somehow. So that we can avoid further generalities, let me provide some practical examples. In tables 4.4 through 4.11 you will find some examples of readings index cards. Instead of inventing topics and methods, I retrieved the index cards from my own thesis, The Aesthetics of Thomas Aquinas. My filing method is not necessarily the best one. These index cards provide an example of a method that facilitated different types of index cards. You will see that I was not as precise as I recommend that much information is missing, while other information is excessively elliptical. In fact, I learned some of the lessons in this book later in my career, but it is not a given that you should make the same mistakes that I did. I have not altered the style or obscured the naivete of these examples, and you can take them for what they are worth. Let us go over these examples one by one. Croce index card. This was a short review, important because of the author. Since I had already found the book reviewed, I copied only this single, significant opinion. Look at the final squared brackets. That statement represents exactly what I did in my thesis, 2 years later. Biondolillo index card. This is a polemical index card, showing all the irritation of the neophyte who sees his argument scorned. I found it necessary to record my ideas this way, perhaps to insert a polemical note in my work. Glenn's index card. I quickly consulted with a German friend who helped me understand precisely what this thick book discussed. This book did not have immediate relevance to my work, but it was perhaps worthy of a note. Maritain index card. I already knew art and scholasticism, this author's fundamental work, but I did not find him very trustworthy. At the end of the card, I made a note that would remind me not to trust the accuracy of his quotes without a subsequent check. Chenu index card. This is a short essay by a serious scholar on a very important theme in my work, and I squeezed as much juice from it as I could. This essay was the classic case of an indirect source. I noted only what I could then check directly. This card was more of a bibliographical supplement than a readings index card. Curtius index card, an important book that I consulted only for a particular section. I was in a hurry, so I only skimmed the rest of the book. I did return to it and read it later for other purposes, after I completed my thesis. Mark index card, an interesting article from which I extracted the juice. Second index card. This is what we might call a disposal index card, as its purpose was essentially to remind me that I did not need this source for my thesis. Table 4.4 Readings Index Card. Table 4.5 Readings Index Card. Table 4.6 Readings Index Card. Table 4.7 Readings Index Card. Table 4.8 Readings Index Card. Table 4.9 Readings Index Card. Table 4.10 Readings Index Card. Table 4.11 Readings Index Card. As you can see, I used abbreviations in the top right corner of these cards in the manner I have described above. In fact, the lowercase letters in parentheses replace colored points that were on the original cards. There is no need for me to explain exactly to what these referred, it is only important to note that I used them to organize my cards. 4.2.4 Academic Humility. Do not let this subsection's title frighten you. It is not an ethical disquisition. It concerns reading and filing methods. You may have noticed that on one of the cards, as a young scholar, I teased the author Biondolillo by dismissing him in a few words. I am still convinced that I was justified in doing so, because the author attempted to explain the important topic of the aesthetics of Thomas Aquinas in only 18 lines. This case was extreme, but I filed the card on the book, and I noted the author's opinion anyway. I did this not only because we must record all the opinions expressed on our topic, but also because the best ideas may not come from the major authors. And now, to prove this, I will tell you the story of the Abbot Valet. To fully understand this story, I should explain the question that my thesis posed, and the interpretive stumbling block that obstructed my work for about a year. Since this problem is not of general interest, let us say succinctly thought for contemporary aesthetics, Themimentoff perception of beauty is generally an intuitive moment, but for St. Thomas the category of intuition did not exist. Many contemporary interpreters have striven to demonstrate that he had somehow talked about intuition, and in the process they did violence to his work. On the other hand, St. Thomas's moment of the perception of objects was so rapid and instantaneous that it did not explain the enjoyment of complex aesthetic qualities, such as the contrast of proportions, the relationship between the essence of a thing, and the way in which this essence organizes matter, etc. The solution was in the discovery that aesthetic contemplation lay in the much more complex act of judgment. But St. Thomas did not explicitly say this. Nevertheless, the way in which he spoke of the contemplation of beauty could only lead to this conclusion. Often this is precisely the scope of interpretive research, to bring an author to say explicitly what he did not say, but that he could not have avoided saying had the question been posed to him. In other words, to show how, by comparing the various statements, that answer must emerge in the terms of the author's scrutinized thought. Maybe the author did not give the answer because he thought it obvious, or because, as in the case of St. Thomas, He had never organically treated the question of aesthetics, but always discussed it incidentally, taking the matter for granted. Therefore, I had a problem, and none of the authors I was reading helped me solve it. And one day, while I was wandering disconsolate and looking for texts to aid me, I found at a stand in Paris a little book that attracted me at first for its beautiful binding. I opened it and found that it was a book by a certain Abbot Vallée, titled Les du Beau dans la Philosophie de Saint Thomas d'Aquin. I had not found it in any bibliography. It was the work of a minor 19th-century author. Naturally, I purchased it. I began to read it, and I realized that the Abbot Vallée was a poor fellow who repeated preconceived ideas and did not discover anything new. If I continued to read him, it was not for academic humility, but for pure stubbornness, and to recoup the money I had spent. I continued reading, and at a certain point, almost in parentheses, said, probably unintentionally, the abbot not realizing his statement's significance, I found a reference to the theory of judgment linked to that of beauty. Eureka! I had found the key, provided by the poor Abbot Vallée, who had died 100 years before, who was long since forgotten, and yet who still had something to teach to someone willing to listen. This is academic humility, the knowledge that anyone can teach us something. Perhaps this is because we are so clever that we succeed in having someone less skilled than us teach us something, or because even someone who does not seem very clever to us has some hidden skills, or also because someone who inspires us may not inspire others. The reasons are many. The point is that we must listen with respect to anyone, without this exempting us from pronouncing our value judgments, or from the knowledge that an author's opinion is very different from ours, and that he is ideologically very distant from us. But even the sternest opponent can suggest some ideas to us. It may depend on the weather, the season, and the hour of the day. Perhaps, had I read the Abbot Vallée a year before, I would not have caught the hint. And who knows how many people more capable than I had read him without finding anything interesting. But I learned from that episode that if I wanted to do research, as a matter of principle I should not exclude any source. This is what I call academic humility. Maybe this is hypocritical because it actually requires pride rather than humility, but do not linger on moral questions, whether pride or humility, practice it. 5. Writing the thesis. 5.1. The audience. To whom do you speak when you write your thesis? To your advisor? To all the students or scholars who will have the chance to consult the work in the future? To the general public of non-specialists? Should you conceive the thesis as a book that will find its way into the hands of thousands of readers? Or as a learned report to an academic institution? These are important questions because they concern first and foremost the expository form that you will give to your work, but they also concern the level of internal clarity that you hope to achieve. Let us immediately eliminate a misunderstanding. It is a common belief that a popular work, where the topic is explained so that anyone can understand it, requires less skill than a specialized scientific report that expresses itself through formulas intelligible only to a few privileged readers. This is not completely true. Certainly the discovery of Einstein's equation E equals mc required much more ingenuity than, for example, even the most brilliant physics textbook. But usually works that do not affably explain the terms they use reveal authors who are more insecure than those who make every reference and every step explicit. If you read the great scientists or the great critics, you will see that, with a few exceptions, they are quite clear and are not ashamed of explaining things well. Let us then say that a thesis is a work that, for pragmatic reasons, you should address to your advisor, but that is also meant to be read and consulted by others, even scholars who are not well versed in that particular discipline. So, in a philosophy thesis, it will certainly not be necessary to begin by explaining what philosophy is, and similarly it will not be necessary to explain what a volcano is in a thesis on volcanology. But immediately below this level of obvious knowledge, you should provide the readers with all the information they need to understand your thesis. First of all, it is necessary to define your terms, unless they are irrefutable canonical terms of the discipline. In a thesis on formal logic, I will not have to define the term implication, but in a thesis on the philosopher Clarence Irving Lewis's notion of strict implication, I will have to define the difference between this term and material implication. In a thesis in linguistics, I will not have to define the notion of phoneme, unless my topic is the definition of the term as used by the linguist Roman Jacobson. Yet if I use the word sign in the same thesis in linguistics, it might not be a bad idea to define this term, because different authors use it to define different entities. Therefore, as a general rule, define all the technical terms used as key categories in your argument. Secondly, we must not necessarily presume that the readers have done the work that we have done. If we have written a thesis on Cavour, one of the major figures in the unification of Italy, our readers may already be familiar with him. But if our thesis is on a less widely known patriot like Felice Cavallotti, it may not be a bad idea to remind the readers, if only succinctly, when he lived, when he was born, and how he died. As I write, I have in front of me two theses in the humanities, one on Giovanni Battista Andreini and the other on Pierre Ramon de Saint-Albin. I would be willing to wager that, in a group of 100 university professors that includes many experts in the humanities, only a small percentage would be familiar with these two minor authors. Now, the first thesis gets off to a bad start with the following sentence. The history of studies on Giovan Battista Andreini begins with a list of his works compiled by Leone Lacci, theologian and scholar of Greek origin who contributed to the history of theater. You can imagine the disappointment of readers expecting an introduction to Andreini, and who instead must wade through biographical information about Lacci. But the author of the thesis may respond, Andreini is the hero of my thesis. Exactly, and if he is your hero, hurry up and introduce him to your readers, and do not trust the fact that the advisor knows who he is. This is not simply a private letter to the advisor, it is potentially a book meant for humanity. The second thesis begins more appropriately. The object of our thesis is a text that appeared in France in 1747, written by an author who left very few other traces of himself, Pierre Ramon de Saint-Albin. It then proceeds to introduce the text and its importance. To me, this seems like the correct way to begin. I know that Saint-Albin lived in the 18th century and that, if I don't know much about him, I am excused by the fact that he left few traces of his life. 5.2. How to write. Once we have decided to whom to write, we must decide how to write, and this is quite a difficult question. If there were exhaustive rules, we would all be great writers. I could at least recommend that you rewrite your thesis many times, or that you take on other writing projects before embarking on your thesis, because writing is also a question of training. In any case, I will provide some general suggestions. You are not Proust. Do not write long sentences. If they come into your head, write them, but then break them down. Do not be afraid to repeat the subject twice, and stay away from too many pronouns and subordinate clauses. Do not write. The pianist Wittgenstein, brother of the well-known philosopher who wrote the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus Tautodemoni, considered the masterpiece of contemporary philosophy, happened to have Ravel write for him a concerto for the left hand, since he had lost the right one in the war. Write instead. The pianist Paul Wittgenstein was the brother of the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. Since Paul was maimed of his right hand, the composer Maurice Ravel wrote a concerto for him that required only the left hand. Or, the pianist Paul Wittgenstein was the brother of the famous philosopher, author of the Tractatus. The pianist had lost his right hand in the war. For this reason, the composer Maurice Ravel wrote a concerto for him that required only the left hand. Do not write. The Irish writer had renounced family, country, and church, and stuck to his plans. It can hardly be said of him that he was a politically committed writer, even if some have mentioned Fabian and socialist inclinations with respect to him. When World War II erupted, he tended to deliberately ignore the tragedy that shook Europe, and he was preoccupied solely with the writing of his last work. Rather right. Joyce had renounced family, country, and church. He stuck to his plans. We cannot say that Joyce was a politically committed writer, even if some have gone so far as describing a Fabian and socialist Joyce. When World War II erupted, Joyce deliberately ignored the tragedy that shook Europe. His sole preoccupation was the writing of Finnegan's Wake. Even if it seems literary, please do not write. When Stockhausen speaks of clusters, he does not have in mind Schoenberg's series or Webern's series. If confronted, the German musician would not accept the requirement to avoid repeating any of the 12 notes before the series has ended. The notion of the cluster itself is structurally more unconventional than that of the series. On the other hand, Webern followed the strict principles of the author of A Survivor from Warsaw. Now, the author of Mantra goes well beyond. And as for the former, it is necessary to distinguish between the various phases of his oeuvre. Barrio agrees, it is not possible to consider this author as a dogmatic serialist. You will notice that, at some point, you can no longer tell who is who. In addition, defining an author through one of his works is logically incorrect. It is true that lesser critics refer to Alessandro Manzoni simply as the author of The Betrothed, perhaps for fear of repeating his name too many times. But the author of The Betrothed is not the biographical character Manzoni in his totality. In fact, in a certain context we could say that there is a notable difference between the author of The Betrothed and the author of Adelchi, even if they are one and the same biographically speaking Gonda according to their birth certificate. For this reason, I would rewrite the above passage as follows. When Stockhausen speaks of a cluster, he does not have in mind either the series of Schoenberg or that of Webern. If confronted, Stockhausen would not accept the requirement to avoid repeating any of the 12 notes before the end of the series. The notion of the cluster itself is structurally more unconventional than that of the series. Webern, by contrast, followed the strict principles of Schoenberg, but Stockhausen goes well beyond. And even for Webern, it is necessary to distinguish among the various phases of his oeuvre. Barrio also asserts that it is not possible to think of Webern as a dogmatic serialist. You are not E. Cummings. Cummings was an American avant-garde poet who is known for having signed his name with lowercase initials. Naturally, he used commas and periods with great thriftiness, he broke his lines into small pieces, and in short he did all the things that an avant-garde poet can and should do. But you are not an avant-garde poet. Not even if your thesis is on avant-garde poetry. If you write a thesis on Caravaggio, are you then a painter? And if you write a thesis on the style of the Futurists, please do not write as a futurist writes. This is important advice because nowadays many tend to write alternative theses, in which the rules of critical discourse are not respected. But the language of the thesis is a metalanguage, that is, a language that speaks of other languages. A psychiatrist who describes the mentally ill does not express himself in the manner of his patients. I am not saying that it is wrong to express oneself in the manner of the so-called mentally ill. In fact, you could reasonably argue that they are the only ones who express themselves the way one should. But here you have two choices: either you do not write a thesis, and you manifest your desire to break with tradition by refusing to earn your degree, perhaps learning to play the guitar instead, or you write your thesis, but then you must explain to everyone why the language of the mentally ill is not a crazy language. And to do it you must use a metalanguage intelligible to all. The pseudo-poet who writes his thesis in poetry is a pitiful writer. From Dante to Eliot and from Eliot to Sanguinetti, when avant-garde poets wanted to talk about their poetry, they wrote in clear prose. And when Marx wanted to talk about workers, he did not write as a worker of his time, but as a philosopher. Then, when he wrote the Communist Manifesto with Engels in 1848, he used a fragmented journalistic style that was provocative and quite effective. Yet again, the Communist Manifesto is not written in the style of Capital, a text addressed to economists and politicians. Do not pretend to be Dante by saying that the poetic fury dictates deep within and that you cannot surrender to the flat and pedestrian metalanguage of literary criticism. Are you a poet? Then do not pursue a university degree. 20th-century Italian poet Eugenio Montale does not have a degree, and he is a great poet nonetheless. His contemporary Carlo Emilio Gatta wrote fiction in a unique style, full of dialects and stylistic idiosyncrasies, but when he wrote a manual for radio news writers, he wrote a clever, sharp, and lucid recipe book full of clear and accessible prose. And when Montale writes a critical article, he writes so that all can understand him, including those who do not understand his poems. Begin new paragraphs often. Do so when logically necessary, and when the pace of the text requires it, but the more you do it, the better. Write everything that comes into your head, but only in the first draft. You may notice that you get carried away with your inspiration, and you lose track of the center of your topic. In this case, you can remove the parenthetical sentences and the digressions, or you can put each in a note or an appendix. Your thesis exists to prove the hypothesis that you devised at the outset, not to show the breadth of your knowledge. Use the advisor as a guinea pig. You must ensure that the advisor reads the first chapters far in advance of the deadline. His reactions may be useful to you. If the advisor is busy, ask a friend. Ask if he understands what you are writing. Do not play the solitary genius. Do not insist on beginning with the first chapter. Perhaps you have more documentation on chapter 4. Start there, with the nonchalance of someone who has already worked out the previous chapters. You will gain confidence. Naturally, your working table of contents will anchor you, and will serve as a hypothesis that guides you. Do not use ellipses and exclamation points, and do not explain ironies. It is possible to use language that is referential or language that is figurative. By referential language, I mean a language that is recognized by all, in which all things are called by their most common name, and that does not lend itself to misunderstandings. The Venice-Milan train indicates in a referential way the same object that the arrow of the lagoon indicates figuratively. This exemplifies everyday communication is possible with partially figurative language. Ideally, a critical essay or a scholarly text should be written referentially, but it can also be useful to use metaphor, irony, or litotes. Here is a referential text, followed by its transcription in figurative terms that are at least tolerable. Krasnopolsky is not a very sharp critic of Danieli's work. His interpretation draws meaning from the author's text that the author probably did not intend. Consider the line, "in the evening gazing at the clouds." Ritz interprets this as a normal geographical annotation, whereas Krasnopolsky sees a symbolic expression that alludes to poetic activity. One should not trust Ritz's critical acumen, and one should also distrust Krasnopolsky. Hilton observes that, if Ritz's writing seems like a tourist brochure, Krasnopolsky's criticism reads like a Lenten sermon. And he adds, truly, two perfect critics. We are not convinced that Krasnopolsky is the sharpest critic of Danieli's work. In reading his author, Krasnopolsky gives the impression that he is putting words into Danieli's mouth. Consider the line, "in the evening gazing at the clouds." Ritz interprets it as a normal geographical annotation, whereas Krasnopolsky plays the symbolism card and sees an allusion to poetic activity. Ritz is not a prodigy of critical insight, but Krasnopolsky should also be handled with care. As Hilton observes, if Ritz's writing seems like a tourist brochure, Krasnopolsky's criticism reads like a Lenten sermon. Truly, two perfect critics. You can see that the figurative version uses various rhetorical devices. First of all, the litotes, saying that you are not convinced that someone is a sharp critic means that you are convinced that he is not a sharp critic. Also, the statement Ritz is not a prodigy of critical insight means that he is a modest critic. Then there are the metaphors, putting words into someone's mouth, and playing the symbolism card. The tourist brochure and the Lenten sermon are two similes, while the observation that the two authors are perfect critics is an example of irony, saying one thing to signify its opposite. Now, we either use rhetorical figures effectively, or we do not use them at all. If we use them, it is because we presume our reader is capable of catching them, and because we believe that we will appear more incisive and convincing. In this case, we should not be ashamed of them, and we should not explain them. If we think that our reader is an idiot, we should not use rhetorical figures, but if we use them and feel the need to explain them, we are essentially calling the reader an idiot. In turn, he will take revenge by calling the author an idiot. Here is how a timid writer might intervene to neutralize and excuse the rhetorical figures he uses. We are not convinced that Krasnopolsky is the sharpest critic of Danieli's work. In reading his author, Krasnopolsky gives the impression that he is putting words into Danieli's mouth. Consider Danieli's line, "In the evening gazing at the clouds." Ritz interprets this as a normal geographical annotation, whereas Krasnopolsky plays the symbolism card and sees an allusion to poetic activity. Ritz is not a prodigy of critical insight, but Krasnopolsky should also be handled with care. As Hilton ironically observes, if Ritz's writing seems like a vacation brochure, Krasnopolsky's criticism reads like a Lenten sermon. And he defines them as two models of critical perfection. But all joking aside, I am convinced that nobody could be so intellectually petit bourgeois as to conceive a passage so studded with shyness and apologetic little smiles. Of course I exaggerated in this example, and here I say that I exaggerated because it is didactically important that the parody be understood as such. In fact, many bad habits of the amateur writer are condensed into this third example. First of all, the use of quotation marks to warn the reader, "Pay attention because I am about to say something big." Puerile. Quotation marks are generally only used to designate a direct quotation or the title of an essay or short work, to indicate that a term is jargon or slang, or that a term is being discussed in the text as a word, rather than used functionally within the sentence. Secondly, the use of the exclamation point to emphasize a statement. This is not appropriate in a critical essay. If you check the book you are reading, you will notice that I have used the exclamation mark only once or twice. It is allowed once or twice, if the purpose is to make the reader jump in his seat and call his attention to a vehement statement like, "Pay attention, never make this mistake." But it is a good rule to speak softly. The effect will be stronger if you simply say important things. Finally, the author of the third passage draws attention to the ironies, and apologizes for using them. Surely, if you think that Hilton's irony is too subtle, you can write, "Hilton states with subtle irony that we are in the presence of two perfect critics." But the irony must be really subtle to merit such a statement. In the quoted text, after Hilton has mentioned the vacation brochure and the Lenten sermon, the irony was already evident and needed no further explanation. The same applies to the statement, "But all joking aside." Sometimes a statement like this can be useful to abruptly change the tone of the argument, but only if you were really joking before. In this case, the author was not joking. He was attempting to use irony and metaphor, but these are serious rhetorical devices and not jokes. You may observe that, more than once in this book, I have expressed a paradox and then warned that it was a paradox. For example, in section 2.6.1, I proposed the existence of the mythical centaur for the purpose of explaining the concept of scientific research. But I warned you of this paradox not because I thought you would have believed this proposition. On the contrary, I warned you because I was afraid that you would have doubted too much, and hence dismissed the paradox. Therefore I insisted that, despite its paradoxical form, my statement contained an important truth, that research must clearly define its object so that others can identify it even if this object is mythical. And I made this absolutely clear because this is a didactic book in which I care more that everyone understands what I want to say than about a beautiful literary style. Had I been writing an essay, I would have pronounced the paradox without denouncing it later. Always define a term when you introduce it for the first time. If you do not know the definition of a term, avoid using it. If it is one of the principal terms of your thesis and you are not able to define it, call it quits. You have chosen the wrong thesis. Do not explain the location of Rome without then explaining the location of Timbuktu. It gives me chills to read sentences like, Guzzo defined the Jewish Dutch pantheist philosopher Spinoza. Stop! Either you are writing a thesis on Spinoza, and in this case your reader already knows who Spinoza is, and also you will already have informed the reader that Augusto Guzzo wrote a book on Spinoza, or you are quoting this statement tangentially in a thesis on nuclear physics. And in this case you should presume that the reader is aware of Spinoza but not of Guzzo, or you are writing a thesis on post-Gentilian philosophy in Italy, and you can expect your reader to know both Guzzo and Spinoza. Even in a thesis on history, do not write T. S. Eliot, an English poet. Take it for granted that T. S. Eliot is universally known. At most, if you wish to emphasize that it was precisely an English poet who said something particular, you will write, it was an English poet, Eliot, who said that. But if you write a thesis on Eliot, have the humility to provide all the information about him in the text. If not in the text, at least provide it in a note near the beginning, and be honest and precise enough to condense all of his necessary biographical information into 10 lines. The reader, as much as he may know the subject, will not necessarily have memorized Eliot's birthday. Take this into consideration when you write a work on a minor author of past centuries. Do not presume that everyone knows of him. One never knows. Immediately introduce him, his cultural context, and so on. But even if the author was Molière, how much will it cost you to insert a note with a couple of dates? I or we? Should the student introduce his opinions in the first person? Should he state, I think that? Some believe that this is more honest than using the majestic plural. I disagree. A writer says we because he presumes that his readers can share what he is saying. Writing is a social act. I write so that you as the reader accept what I propose to you. At the most, I think, the student can try to avoid personal pronouns, be adopted more impersonal expressions such as, therefore one should conclude that, it then seems granted that, one should say at this point, one should presume, therefore one infers that, in examining this text one sees that, etc. It is not necessary to say, the article that we previously quoted, when it suffices to say, the article previously quoted. But I think the student can write, the article previously quoted shows us that, because these types of expressions do not imply any personalization of the academic discourse. 5.3 Quotations 5.3.1 When and how to quote, 10 rules. Generally speaking, you will quote many texts by other authors in your thesis, the textual object of your work, or the primary source or sources, and the critical literature on your topic, or the secondary sources. Therefore, practically speaking, there are two kinds of quotes: quotes from a text that you will interpret, quotes from a text that you will use to support your interpretation. It is difficult to say abstractly whether you should quote abundantly or sparingly. It depends on the type of thesis you are writing. A critical analysis of a writer obviously requires that large passages of his works be quoted and analyzed. In other cases, a quote can be a manifestation of laziness, for example if the candidate is unwilling or unable to summarize a collection of data and prefers to let someone else do it for him. Hence, we provide the following 10 rules. Rule 1. Quote the object of your interpretive analysis with reasonable abundance. Rule 2. Quote the critical literature only when its authority corroborates or confirms your statements. These two rules imply some obvious corollaries. First, if the passage you wish to analyze exceeds half a page, it means something is wrong. Either your analysis is too general and you will not be able to comment on the text point by point, or you are discussing an entire text rather than a passage, and presenting a global criticism rather than an analysis. In these cases, if the text is important but too long, present it in full in an appendix, and quote only short passages over the course of your chapters. Second, when quoting or citing critical literature, be sure that it says something new or that it confirms authoritative wave side. The following illustrates a useless quote and a useless citation. Mass communication constitutes, as McLuhan says, one of the central phenomena of our time. We should not forget that, in our country alone, 2 out of 3 individuals spend a third of their day in front of the TV, according to Savoy. What is wrong or naive in this example? First, that mass communication is a central phenomenon of our time is a banality that anyone could have said. I do not exclude the possibility that McLuhan himself may have said it, but it is not necessary to refer to an authority to prove something so obvious. Second, it is possible that the data on the TV audience is accurate, but Savoy does not constitute an authority. The author of the thesis should have cited the data of the Italian Central Institute of Statistics, a sociological research project signed by renowned scholars who are beyond suspicion, or the results of his own inquiry backed up by an appendix of tables that present his data, rather than citing just any old Savoy. Rule 3. If you don't want readers to presume that you share the opinion of the quoted author, you must include your own critical remarks before or after the passage. Rule 4. Make sure that the author and the source of your quote are clearly identifiable. You can do this by including one of the following: a superscript number and a corresponding note, especially when you mention the author for the first time, the author's name and the work's publication date, in parentheses after the quote, the page number in parentheses, but only when the entire chapter centers on the same work by the same author. Table 5.1 illustrates how you could structure a page of a thesis with the title Epiphany in James Joyce's portrait. In this case, once you have clarified to which edition you refer, cite your primary source with the page number in parentheses in the text, and cite the critical literature in the note. Table 5.1. Example of the continuous analysis of a single text. The text of Portrait is rich with these moments of ecstasy that Joyce had already defined in Stephen Heroa's Epiphanic. Glimmering and trembling and unfolding, a breaking light, an opening flower, it spread in endless succession to itself, breaking in full crimson and unfolding and fading to palest rose, leaf by leaf and wave of light by wave of light, flooding all the heavens with its soft flushes, every flush deeper than other. It is immediately evident that the submarine vision changes to the vision of a flame, in which red tones and sensations of brightness prevail. Now, we know that metaphors of fire frequently recur in Portrait, and that the word fire appears at least 59 times and variations of the word flame appear 35 times. Here we can see the association between fire and the epiphanic experience, and these illuminates relations between Portrait and Gabriele D'Annunzio's The Flame. Let us examine this passage from Portrait. Or was it that, being as weak of sight as he was shy of mind, he drew less pleasure from the reflection of the glowing sensible world through the prism of a language many-colored and richly storied? Here we find a stunning reference to a passage in D'Annunzio's The Flame. She was compelled into that blazing environment as though into a forge. Leslie Hancock, Word Index to James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist. Rule 5. Quote your primary source from the critical edition, or the most canonical edition. In a thesis on Balzac, avoid quoting the pages from the paperback Livre de Poche edition, and at least quote from the Plié edition of Balzac's complete works. In general, for ancient and classical authors it is sufficient to cite sections, chapters, and lines according to current usage. Regarding contemporary authors, if various editions are available, it is better to cite either from the first, or from the most recent if it is revised and corrected. The first edition is preferable if the following editions are simply reprints, and the last edition is preferable if it contains revisions, additions, or updates. In any case, your reference should specify both the first edition and the most recent edition, and should clarify from which one you are quoting. Rule 6. When your primary source is foreign, quote it in the original language. This rule is mandatory for literary works. In these cases, adding a translation in parentheses or in a note may be useful, but follow your advisor's suggestions on this. Even if you are not analyzing the literary style of an author, if the exact expression of his thought, in all of its linguistic shades, has a certain weight, then you should work